joining us through the chat.
Yeah, so if you are joining us through the chat, do please put any questions that occur to you into the chat, and then I'll put them to the professors as the time comes on your behalf.
Fantastic. So yeah, let's start with introductions then. Why don't we start with the room there in Cambridge? Maybe you can start us off.
Sure. Hi, I'm Rupert Wegerif. I don't suppose Michael remembers, but I met him in Sevilla when they were founding all those early socio-cultural and chat conferences with Jim Birch and people. So I was delighted to have you here. And of course, I've met Roy at a couple of CSCL conferences, but this was a while ago. So it's great to have you here. I'm the director of DEFI Digital Education Futures, and we're trying to organize a Cambridge-wide research network to explore exactly these issues, which is why we're delighted to read this paper.
Great.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ruth Kirshner, also here in the Faculty of Education. I've been interested in Michael and Roy's work for many, many years, so I was very excited to have this opportunity to come to this session and meet you and hear you talk in person together.
I'm Sarah Hennessy, just to echo what Ruth just said. Really excited to be in this session. I also work here in the faculty, and I'm also one of the research directors of the EdTech Hub, which is looking at EdTech and equity issues in low-income countries. So bringing a slightly different angle to it.
My name is Ryan Irvin. I'm a PhD student here at the Faculty of Education and a former middle school teacher in San Diego. So that's where I first heard of your work.
Alison Twiner. I'm a research associate over at Hughes Hall in Cambridge, and I'm working with Sarah Hennessy in particular on CAMTRE, Cambridge Teacher Research Exchange. And I think I am in equal measure thrilled and terrified to be offering some comments on my readings of the paper.
I'm the PhD student here in the Faculty of Education and working as a teacher education and very interested in the technology it has to help us to build a better world. So I'm very interested. I'm very happy to see you guys in person.
I'm Tianyi. I'm an MPhil student of Rupert, and I want to do an online technology, how to use online technology for online discussion for my thesis. So that's why this topic is of great interest for me. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kevin Martin. I'm the center manager for DEFI and a step-in videographer. And thank you for joining us today, Michael and Roy. It's wonderful to meet you.
Fantastic. So I think that's everybody in the room. Alison has already introduced herself. What about you, Dina?
Hey, I'm Dina. I am a second-year PhD student at the Faculty of Education. I am currently in Mexico because I'm doing my fieldwork. I'm studying or trying to understand the use of learning through play in public schools here in Mexico. And I was also part of DEFI in some projects, so I'm very happy to be here today.
Imogen?
Hi, I'm Imogen Casebourne, and I'm research lead at DEFI. And to echo what many others have said, extremely excited to be here today and hear the discussion.
Barry, Judith, I don't know if you want to introduce yourselves, or if you can.
Don't worry.
Okay. Okay, so Barry?
Oh, where am I? I don't even know where I am.
Barry's in between the two worlds here.
I work with DEFI. I'm the communications officer here, and I'm working behind the scenes to try to make all of this tech happen today.
Fab. Well, and then it's me. So I'm a postdoc at the Faculty of Education, and I work in self-regulation and school cultures, generally very interested in cultural differences in terms of cognitive processes and schooling processes. Okay, so that's us. Well, And yeah, now over to you, Roy and Mike, if you could, start us off with some background information about this piece of writing.
Youth voices first, Roy.
Well, my first thought is that we have two primary points of contact. One is refracted through Jerome Bruner and our connections to him. Mike was a collaborator with Jerry for a long time. I was his PhD student at Oxford. Secondly, through Rockefeller University. George Miller, who had founded the Center for Cognitive Studies with Jerry Bruner at Harvard, was at Rockefeller, and one of his postdocs heard my dissertation talk, which was on the development of negation in early child language and thought at the Society for Research and Child Development meetings in 1977 in New Orleans. And she said, George would really like your work. Come to Rockefeller and give a talk. And I did, and George said, don't go back to Oxford, stay here. We'll give you a little money a month just to come to seminars and write your dissertation. And that sounded like a pretty good deal. And soon I discovered that Mike's group was a lot more fun than George's group. And they were working on two big chapters. One was what's cultural about cultural psychology. The other was what's cognitive about cognitive anthropology. And of course, it was an amazing environment. Sylvia Scribner was there. Ray McDermott was there. He's now been a colleague of mine for 40 some years. He's on the faculty at Stanford. And there were many great graduate students, including Jan Hawkins, who was a Joe Glick student, one of Mike's collaborators. And Jan and I collaborated a lot on children learning logo programming and social processes relating to that at the Bank Street College of Education, where we had, I think, the world's first Center for Children and Technology. It started in 1980. So those 2 points of contact, Jerry and Rockefeller. Mike, your turn to bring us up to the moment.
Well, there's another point of contact is Stephen Toulmin.
Oh, yes.
So, right. So Roy has had a long engagement with Stephen Toulmin, who I'd never met. And Toulmin wrote a review of the collection of essays of Vygotsky that we put out in 1978. And I think I was in Liberia at the time. I had no idea that review, I didn't know Toulmin, I didn't know about the review. And we got this review, and Sylvia and I looked at it and said, oh my God, there goes Vygotsky. And we just thought, oh, it's going to be a popularization of this thing in a way that's just going to create all sorts of confusion, just like it did with Piaget. And I think that's not a reasonable account of what's been happening in the last 40 years. Jesus, 4 decades.
I'm responsible for that review, and that I called Stephen, told him that you had this manuscript.
Yeah.
Regularly wrote for the New York Review of Books, and he said, I very much want to write this review. I'm going to call him the Mozart of the mind. And
there you go.
The rest is history. Stephen, I met, and this is a great story, when I was 18. I was a first-generation low-income college kid born and raised in Detroit, parents from rural Kentucky. And I only applied to one college, Michigan State, because I didn't have counselors at my high school that even encouraged college. And when I registered for the first quarter at Michigan State, I happened to get a great advisor who was encouraging me to pursue my interest in how the mind works. And he says, well, you should take cognitive psychology classes, you should take linguistics classes, and you should definitely take a class with Stephen Toulmin, who's visiting from Cambridge this year. And I said, well, that sounds kind of intimidating. He's a student of Wittgenstein's, right? And he says, yes. He says, but you'll really like him. So here I am, I'm 18. I go knock on Stephen Toulmin's door at the philosophy department at Michigan State. And I said, I'm very interested in taking your course, but I've only had one course in philosophy, and it was in existentialism. And he said, Roy, don't worry, I will share with you anything that I believe you should read and have any conversations you'd like. And that relationship continued until Stephen died, and I was called by the New York Times to summarize his contributions over 60 years of his career.
Well,
so we were colleagues together at Northwestern, and he mentored me through virtually every phase of my life.
So there's another connection. So you folks in Cambridge have brought this discussion together, and we should turn it over to you, and let's hear from you.
Thank you very much for that lovely, very personal introduction to the collaboration. So I guess what we're going to do now is to leave Alison to react a little bit to the paper, and then Dina. Thanks.
All right. Thanks very much. So one of the things I was drawn to in this paper was the refrain throughout that history matters. And within this, the focus on socio-technical systems rather than just on isolated tools. And I was drawn to P. Cole's description of socio-technical systems as an entanglement of humans with each other, the tools, arts, crafts, practices, and systematized, institutionalized ways of life of their time and circumstances. So a hugely complex interweaving of what's involved in this. So very much a focus on contextualized use of the tool. And of course, agency comes into this, but I started to wonder, where does the agency lie? He and Cole offer a compelling historical analysis of education systems that have remained remarkably unchanged for a long period and across contexts. In this, often referred to as transfer and passing down of mandated curricula deemed of value by the elders and often the elite. An agency in this case is often for those who've got access, but agency is still pretty limited. But they hint at a positive sense of shaping the future. If, as they contend, a 6-year-old is indeed more adept at using technological tools than their parents or teachers, might these 6-year-olds, if encouraged to do so, develop to shape their own futures, rather than just following footsteps or sitting in rows, or being led by historically and culturally recognized patterns of tools. And we know this from creativity tests such as other uses for a paperclip or hammer. It's really hard to break those molds. And extending this further then, will these 6-year-olds, through agency in the socio-technical system, develop their use and adaptation of tools to create new futures not previously envisaged? We know that many job roles that current school students will go into in the future don't exist yet. So who is it that will be creating the space and rationale for these roles? Who will determine what skills and practices have value if parents and teachers don't have the skills or access to the practices that their younger learners do? So in this respect, I wonder, does culture change tool use, or does changing tool use change culture? And I'm fairly sure it's somewhere in between the two. So clearly here, there's a contrast between learning by sitting in rows and being taught to the social connectivity and potential of new media. P. and Cole in the paper highlight how socio-technical systems have been radically overhauled by wider access to ever cheaper tools and high-speed connectivity between them. So again, this returns us to the issue of access, shifting patterns of digital divides in terms of who has access and agency. And this is contrasted to the detrimental effects highlighted of digital attention, what P. and Cole referred to as media multitasking, and suggestions of too much screen time when considered against what people aren't doing if they're on screen. Now, it's apparent that the paper was written in pre-COVID times, and of course, the socio-technical system had to shift substantially when the bulk of learning had switched to online. So how much use was made of the social capacity of digital tools in this online context? The situation drew a huge and perhaps still not enough spotlight on digital divides and access, and what it meant to be out of school when school and education is no longer a physical place. And we can think of this in terms of the number and type of devices that people had access to, whether they had connectivity and the speed of this, whether they were accessing internet via prepaid bundles or constant access, and even a quiet and safe space in which to engage. So this represents elements of the socio-technical system of learning in a pandemic, and I'm fairly sure I've just scratched the surface. So where a huge amount of screen time was needed, just in order to maintain the formal learning within the home context. But are such technologies and devices being welcomed back into the classroom? Or are we still seeing mobile phones, as P and Cole contend, as a subversive force in the classroom, disrupting educational processes as tools for social life or cheating? Probably the latter in most cases, unfortunately. So in this sense, recent history matters. What have we learned from supporting learning during a pandemic that we could implement or change to make the education system more equitable, more accessible, and more relevant for future needs? Where jobs that school leavers will go into may not exist yet, using tools within socio-technical systems that they can already use better than their teachers or parents. So let's look not at what technologies erodes or fragments in existing boundaries and practices, but on the opportunities it can afford when used considerately and mindfully to connect, to query, to create and communicate. And I'll leave it there and hand over to Dina.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you very much, Alison. So yeah, I found this article to be really interesting. First, because it highlights more tangibly how we can learn and understand what happened in the past to reflect, guide, study, and kind of predict what is happening now with the new technological systems and the new technology developments to come, both in understanding how this changes the social and cultural practices of society, but also the individual influence on development. So thinking on this border crossing of how the past events, even when they are not exactly the same phenomena, can inform what happens in the present and what might happen in the future. In this sense, it also inspired me to think about the importance of taking advantage of crossing the field borders. In this article, we can see how combining evidence from different social sciences, which are usually explored in silos, such as history, anthropology, psychology, can together help explain social and individual changes that have been experienced and will be experienced due to technology and inform more hard sciences such as technology development. This is obviously also endorsed by Michael and Roy when discussing the implications for practice, where they argue the importance of having developmentalists work together with tech developers to help balance the benefits and risks of new media tools and solutions, which I think is one of the main takeaways that I have after reflecting on this article. This importance of cross-disciplinary research and practice. I would also like to acknowledge, and I think Alison touched a little bit this point already, but this article was published in February 2019, just before the COVID pandemic hit globally. In this regard, one question that came into my mind was how the pandemic has accelerated, changed, or confirmed the assumptions argued in the article, and how today, 2 years after the publication of the article, we can have a better picture of the influence that digital technologies as part of our everyday life has on our social and individual development. In addition to that, I think it is very important to reflect, predict, and most importantly, act. Reflecting retrospectively, we can identify the changes occurred due to the development of literacy and numeracy. Society experienced changes in the way education and learning was conducted to help people, or as it is pointed out in the article, this elite or selected people, to help them thrive in a more complex world where trade and commerce were not as simple as in the past. However, this of course created inequalities, which we are even suffering today. So far, we have already identified important changes in how families, schools, and the broader society organizes and communicates with the use of digital technology. And we are slowly learning more and more about how these changes also resonate on behavior and development, and more precisely in children who are, as we know, the first generation with this wide access to technology and digital platforms. In this regard, something that I question myself and maybe our ideas for future research, but what should we do to prevent the risks that were mentioned in the article, such as the mental health risks, performance effects, the degradation of the organisms to cope? What should we do? Is the answer to go back to a life where technology is not part of schools and there is kind of a ban for children to use it? Or should we embrace what we have and find ways to potentialize the benefits of digital technologies, such as learn how to balance our physical and digital life, how to teach children self-regulation and mindfulness to reduce the risk of negative effects from multitasking, but also how to keep challenging and improving education with these new means. And to finish my reflection, what should we do with those affected by the digital divide? Both these differences between elders and young generations, as well as the huge differences between those without access and those with full access. What are the effects for these people? And if by trying to find ways to make a better and larger use of technologies, aren't we perpetuating more and more inequality? What can us researchers from different fields, policy makers, practitioners do? So I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina and Alison. So yeah, so with those really important questions about access, about inequalities, about the relationship between agency and culture, I guess we open the floor to the Cambridge people to see if they, how they react to those ideas, and yeah, what you thought about the paper, and where did it take your mind?
Well, who wants to, thanks, Alison. Who wants to kick off? Your responses to the paper or to Alison's points?
Good to hear from Roy and Michael, their responses. Yeah, it would.
Yeah, but that's later. The idea is they listen to us discussing their paper and then they come in. It's all Pablo's brilliant plan. But, I bet you had a few thoughts. And Kevin, you introduced yourself very modestly as the manager of DEFI, but what about all your research on technology in rural Africa? I think that maybe has some response to the issues raised by Alison and Dina about the inequality of access and the role of technology. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, I'm certainly interested in looking at how technology can increase access, that it can both be a tool that can divide, but it can also be a tool that unites. And listening to what Alison and Dina said about their comments in the paper and our discussion from the last term, I find that in the technology, in the way that it's been used in the context that I've been researching, so rural East Africa and adult learners, the potential for increased access is on par with what happened 20 years ago with the onset of the mobile revolution and the leapfrogging of communication technology. And there's a lot of promise that this same kind of technology can both leapfrog the same kind of educational infrastructure, but it also comes with some pretty concerning disadvantages. And what I hear from what we've all talked about here is, how do you navigate that? Where do you find the balance? And what role do we have as educators and researchers in trying to find where that balance might be?
And do you feel this, equality, because inequality, people are always talking about the digital divide, but they don't always reflect on the division between, say, somebody born in a suburb of Helsinki or somebody born where you're working in rural Kenya. The traditional schooling system is, of course, massively unequal, and yet you're getting effects with mobile phones that are even off the network. Does it not provide a promise, despite the inequality of greater access than the traditional schooling system, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do see what you mean. And it certainly does provide promise. And I think the approach has to be designing the technology around the affordances that are available within that context. And perhaps that's connects to what Alison was saying, that within a classroom, say in Cambridge or San Diego or Palo Alto, the affordances of technology can lend themselves to cheating, where in rural East Africa, it can lend itself to an ability to pass information and knowledge between learners offline. So how do we adapt the technology to, conform to the affordances that will give the desired output that we seek?
Isn't that a cue for you, Sarah?
Yeah, I could come in. I endorse everything that Kevin has just said, and I think there are a number of barriers to equity in technology use, and some of which are recognized and some of which are not often recognized in the research and the implementation of initiatives and things like that. Language is a huge barrier. So 80% of digital content is in English for a start. So that's going to rule out, huge swathes of the world even being able to access. So giving them a device is just one step. You've got to be able to access the content. You have multiple digital divides, not just one, as you kind of alluded to, including access at home. So even if you provide educational technology in an educational setting, we find the research finds that those who have access at home have a huge advantage already. They have digital literacy skills. They have, far more cultural and social capital, economic capital as well often, which helps them to access it. And research shows then that their learning outcomes are greater, even though they've all ostensibly got the same access at school or wherever. So it can appear to be a leveler, but in practice, it doesn't quite work out that way. So yeah, I think there's, it's all about context, isn't it, really? And about adapting to the context, where you are, the constraints you're in, the resources you have, and that's cultural resources, social resources, as well as infrastructural resources. So it's just a case of, I think, developing awareness of those issues and trying to take them on board when designing initiatives, when rolling out technology to different groups and so on.
Because the paper ends with the idea of how we're going to design for the future, taking into account these radical shifts in what cognition means even, I think. That's a cue for Ryan, isn't it? What about that?
Yeah, just playing over and over in my head many of the things that I've heard others say, and some of my own experience with the digital divide. Was at a middle school in San Diego. There was a one-to-one netbook program where they would send internet home with kids and computers home with kids. I did a nice qualitative study to see what they did with the computers at home. They played so many video games at home, but who's to say there's no value in the kids who didn't have the computers learning to play the video games at home? So when you talk about the digital divide, there's the education, but there's also just the day-to-day. There's pop culture, there's so many different uses. And to me, that really plays into when I hear tech in the classroom. Having been a technology teacher, I think of the 3D printers, the software, the hardware. I think of an English class, people using their phones for definitions. And I'm also very scrupulous of where the technology is coming from. So what are the interests of the maybe for-profit companies or other companies? Google coming into the sphere. I use Google Classroom for everything. Love their Google Education Suite. But I'm very skeptical thinking, when did they put a paywall up? YouTube used to be free, then there's ads, now you can pay for it. So really, where's the future of ed tech going as we're handing the reins over to these very large companies and just clicking the box saying, I agree to it. So I think as well as the digital divide in learning outcomes, just what's the role of, so it's relevant to who and relevant for what, I would say, for technology. So is it relevant to the government making the policies for the schools? Is it relevant to the kids in the rural villages? So it just more questions than answers for me. Sorry, last bit of
researchers, isn't it?
Yeah, and just last bit to tie it back up to the cognition, I would say, are we using it for rote memorization, or are we really trying to inspire these yet to be foreseen skills and what are they, 21st century skills that we're about 20 years into? Or are we focused on traditional ways of learning? So, sorry.
Imogen might have some input from the chat audience.
Yes, so I do. So Keith has mentioned that when he was doing his PGC teacher qualification back in 1981, 1982, he took an elective course in educational technology, and back then it was it involved razor blades and sticky tape. As the paper pointed out, technologies has evolved, and things have actually got a lot easier in terms of being able to use technology in the classroom, in his view. So that was a comment that we have in the chat so far.
Pablo, I feel that people are being too polite to Mike and Roy here. Nobody's really challenging what they're saying. Isn't it just basic? You're basically assuming a Marxist view. You're saying all this writing came from economic activity. I understood that hieroglyphs meant sacred writing. That some people trace it to the signs on cave walls. You probably know the cognitive neuroarchaeologist David Lewis Williams, who's talking about the paintings of spiritual energies on the caves. And some people argue these were translated into signs, and that the drive here, and I'm thinking of Habermas's reconstruction of historical materialism, the drive wasn't economic production, it was communication, it was culture, it was being able to form shared sacred stories. What do you think about that as the role of writing and technology now? Because again, you're very negative about Stanislas Dehaene pointed out the negative side of writing. It's not all about developing productive forces. Isn't there a possibility that these so-called negatives are part of a new kind of collective thinking that involves a change in people's identity from all the individualism created by writing, which I think Stephen Toulmin wrote about as well as Walter Ong, to a collective thinking, which of course inevitably from an individualistic psychology point of view looks like a loss, a negative, but could be a positive. What do you think?
Age before beauty this time, Roy.
Absolutely.
These comments are very well taken. At the time that we wrote that article 4 years ago, something like that, I was just beginning to go back and restudy all of the stuff that we wrote about the origins of literacy in the Middle East. And we've had quite recently, for example, the work by David Graeber has become extremely well known, and the rethinkings in historical and bio-developmental archaeology. The explosion of information has just been incredible. So I have, if you look at the shelves on the back here, I have a whole shelf about Mesopotamia. To your point, there's the current thinking, I believe, is not one or the other, but trying to understand the connection between the two. The historical origins are really, I'm speaking now of Mesopotamia. There's a somewhat different story, but I think similar and different enough so we can't get into it here. But if you stick with Mesopotamia, I think the evidence is very clear that on the one hand, you have this sort of 10,000 years where people start to settle down, and that in the very beginning of that, you have a redistribution or a problem of redistribution that's associated with settlement. And that problem, when you first see people responding to a change in the way of life, is because there's a place in that small town, 8 houses, a dozen houses in the beginning, maybe 3 or 4 different kinds of homesteads around. There's one house that is a square house. And that square house is divided into 4 parts. And those 4 parts are, as far as the archaeologists can reconstruct it, were all for grain. And the grain was divided into 4 parts, 1 part for seeds for the next year, for the collective, if the individuals don't have enough. Another bin for if it's a hard winter and you need extra food to redistribute it to people. 1 part for the goddess, and 1 part for a festival. And out of that, so that religion and the means of new means of memory, money, obligation, trade, exchange, those means started with tokens, all of like 6 of them. And the story of those tokens that we tell is correct. and it remains. So that you have I don't think there's any argument with respect to the writing side of it, that writing comes from numeracy, that in the beginning, literacy was numeracy, and that you see numeracy developing along with the material technologies so I'm seeing, I had to turn off, the chat because I can't finish my thought. This is a very complicated and maybe I have to cut it short then. It's, as I understand it now, the story of this, let's call it the cognitive line, is correct. And the story about the emergence of schooling as not, it's sometimes the elite, it's that schooling has always been from the very beginning, a mode of power of the elite that came out of accounting, and where religion and economy and ideology, as far as I can tell, were completely mixed together. It's a huge debate going on right now. So I think we were telling part of a story and an outdated part of the story, but the origins of schooling and the way in which schooling, and I think this speaks to some of the comments that we heard earlier, that the mode of schooling that we have and the way in which you folks are thinking about the future seems to be within sort of the given mode that we have now. I really would like to return. I want to stop talking. I'd really like to return to what COVID did show us, which I think is an extrapolation of exactly what we would have thought was had to go on. This system absolutely has got to change, or all it's going to do is be appropriated to more and more centralized forms of power. And I'm happy to run that argument later, if you like.
That's really interesting. That I think that last idea about COVID and how power may be too concentrated bring us back to Alison's point about culture and agency, and accessibility of technologies. And so I just have a question for anybody that might want to answer it. So, like we have culture and industry and society, structures to keep us going, basically. At the other end, we have the people. Some of them are part of the elite, some of them are not. So where does technology fall into all of these? Is it a tool for production and human development in the sense of societal development? Is it a tool that is it making our life easier and therefore our minds dumber to some degree? What is the function of technology in society and in our minds and our means of production? How that that societal, the socio-technical partnership, basically, where does it leave us in terms of development as a society and as humans?
I think one of the interesting things there, Pablo, is what came at the beginning of the paper, reminding us what technology might mean in the broader sense. And in the focus on digital technology or technologies actually may be confining our thinking in quite significant ways. And to go back to what technology itself might have mean and could still mean could actually be helpful. Particularly, I'll add on to this, if it's okay, what I've been thinking about schools and whether there's a danger of letting the school part of the system be taken for granted in what we think it is, and losing the diversity of schools and indeed the role of schools in different societies. So in a way, I would think that some of the conversation can go back to what technology in a general sense might mean and how different activities might involve that sort of thinking, and also how schools can be quite diverse and quite potentially quite open, or at least just to say we need to understand schools better before we break them apart.
So what the role of the schools is, sort of questions. Is it for labor? Is it for, you know, the development of the human being? What is the role of the schools as a piece of technology?
And also, just quickly, just what schools do in the present as well as preparation for the future for children.
Yeah, exactly. Like right now, what are the advantages of schooling practices? Yeah.
I think
sorry. There's a somewhat related question that's been posed in chat, asking about whether post-COVID we might see courses being run in schools or at universities, much as they are now, and then a cheaper course perhaps offered online, which is starting to happen. But is there something about what the school is doing in its embodied place that means it's seen as a better experience, and the purely online experience is somehow seen as lesser and cheaper? And so is that something that may be happening, perhaps was already happening and may be happening post-COVID as well? If I caught that correctly.
I do think we're starting to see a lot of experimentation around making equitable access to higher education. I pro bono consult as a member of the Education Advisory Board for the University of the People, which I encourage you to take a look at. We currently have, I think, over 100,000 students that are earning degrees that they do not have to pay for. They have to pay for exams, and it ends up being a few $100s, and even that can be supported by scholarships. And the University of the People has also been working to create relationships to Edinburgh and Berkeley and other institutions so that refugees, which is an increasing proportion of the University of the People students, have their ability to transfer their credits into these land-based institutions. And that's entirely made possible by a lot of the open access technologies that are increasingly available in open education resources. And the teaching faculty are by and large volunteers from around the planet and a lot of former students.
Fantastic. That's an incredible initiative. How long has that been running for now?
I think it started originally in about 2009. So it's taking a while.
And it's all is online and then can be transferring to universities that have physical facilities.
Yes, that's right.
Fantastic. Well, that's a good thing of technology, isn't it? Can open up as well. I guess it depends on who finances this as well. Who's the person, or like, you know, the company, are companies behind these, you know, like just wealthy people putting their money for the tech?
There's constant fundraising, to be sure, from philanthropies and wealthy individuals, sometimes governments.
Right.
And it suggests new modes of educational organization that are possible.
Right. And then the issue becomes, I mean, that's part of the challenge here, isn't it? There are this enormous potentials. And yet how is it funded? And what's the result of the funding? And Roy is sitting in one of the wealthiest places in the world with a lot of people who have made a lot of money and who see problems in the world and are willing to put their resources behind this and mobilize people. And it's utterly fantastic, right? I'm very focused in sort of speaking to the pre-COVID, post-COVID nature of the discussion here. I've been very impressed by the fact that when COVID hit, I'm speaking now within the United States, there's a global version of this. When COVID hit in the United States 2 years ago, schooling stopped at all levels. schooling stopped. And I've been waiting for the opportunity for people to take the opportunity saying, the whole thing just fell down. Deschooling just happened. Yo, everybody in the deschooling game, where are you now? And I'm beating, through Roy mostly, I'm beating on our National Academy of Education to stop and say, look at the really big picture here. And the really big picture here inside the United States is that the economic and social foundations, larger macro foundations of schooling have been, well, they were shattered to begin with. And now as people are trying like mad to put it back together again, let's get it back together again. But what did we see? We saw that the division, I mean, when you think about the big role of education, it's one generation preparing the next generation to keep on going, right? It's go out and multiply. In some way, you're going to have to be able to reproduce yourself. So that's what education is about, is reproducing the society, of course, with changes, because the environment is always changing, right? It's underneath the whole thing. Now, what we've seen is that the economic foundations for the old model are a mess unless they can make the pandemic really go away. And why are they a mess? Because what are the parents doing? The parents are having to the parents have got to do a hunk of the work of the teacher. Absolutely. If they don't do a bunch of work of the teacher, which is what why the kids need to learn all that self-control in those kinds of circumstances, the kids are going to fail in school. On the other hand, they're working. So they've got to, with their boss, what are they going to do? The teacher isn't, there's no babysitter and the kids can't go to school. I got to work from home. So who's paying people at home? The employers are starting to now go into family life and have a financial stake in promoting family life. So they'll support the babysitters, or they'll find some way, right, to try to do it. And meantime, the teachers who are used to teaching in a place are forced to teach under circumstances just like this, where a whole bunch of the people in the discussion we can't even see, right? And who knows? I think that this is, on the one hand, it's a huge opportunity now, but it has to be done at a sufficient level of aggregation so it's noticeable, so that people could start to think about how to do that. What would be even a system that was based on that? And so when I'm listening to you folks, I really think that you're working still with two within, under the given circumstances of the school. How can we use the technology in bits and pieces? There's nobody thinking about how to think about the underlying economic model to do this in a way that would redistribute things. And there's a part of, and for your institute, it's a fabulous time for you to start on this. Really fabulous. But I think big, you need sociologists and anthropologists and all sorts of other people in the room with you here. Because what the classroom isn't your unit of analysis. It just can't be, right? It can't be anymore.
Planners. You need urban planners. I mean, Nicole Pinkert's work in Chicago.
There you go, right, urban. But people who are used to looking at things at a kind of meso level of reorganization that's large enough for anybody to tell it. The work I do is so tiny, it's so micro, even though I can show the principles, it's like, who cares, right? So there's this activity going on and 500 or 600 kids are involved in it and whatever. Like, who cares? It's like, well, it's a model that can exist at a certain level of aggregation under certain circumstances. How do you get it to go viral? How do you get it to be what do you do? So you want a transformation and you don't want blood. So, I mean, I think you do especially when you're starting off your center, man, I mean, be bold about it, because, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the young guy from San Diego, but too bad we didn't connect up here, because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here too.
That's Ryan.
Yeah, Ryan. I mean, so, and you know yourself about crossing those borders. It's just like really hard. It's really hard in creating these hybrid spaces. So anyway, that's sort of a reaction to the COVID thing. I think it's opened up a sore that was there to begin with. And I'm really arguing that the core of that sore was back in the origins of schooling in Sumer in 3000 BC. And that basic logic has prevailed. There have been other ones that came in. It's tied up with religion from the very, very, very beginning. But it's also the case that it's a single developing system and we've come late. There's the dead hand of the past, right? On the one hand, it's dead in the sense that it's a structure, and damn it, you can only make this thing last for such and such amount of time, and then the stuff around it dissipates. People go away. You can't institutionalize it. So you need people who are really expert on institutionalizing things, institutionalizing change. That means institutionalization means you turn from a person does it, Mike does it, to, oh, the director does it, or the people at the university, somebody does it. There's a role. You turn into the director, not Mike, the director, who's the only one. You have to have next generations for it to be anything other than a firefly, right? That nice metaphor from Larry Kuban. It flash, it works, bang, gone. So I think those are 21st century problems, I think, for education. And we're never going to, in my lifetime, I mean, good luck solving them. From my analysis, right, this has been 5,000 years of the slow growth and domination of a form of life that is insupportable on the planet. So I don't mean to be all gloomy about it and everything, but I'm the old guy in the room now at this point where, you know.
So will you say there's no, I mean, let's go back to the role of technology here, right? Yeah. So it's crystallizing what you call this single developing system and perfecting it, or can it be used, you know, like give it, you know, put it upside down, and can it be used to change the system, or are we already doomed to keep going on the way we've been going for decades and centuries, or can it help us to change?
I don't really know. What you want to do is to try to keep producing variants that move in the direction you think you have to go. How does the system work? You produce new variants that maybe will work better, and you struggle to keep them alive. I mean, that's a big reason why I got into intervention work and did it over a long period of time, is that I was convinced that it's possible over and over again to show the possibility. Like in the laboratory, Rutherford and the early physicists, you know, they had a little cloud chamber. They could see an atom there. So, but not anywhere else. But then gradually, they figured out how to increase it and get a hold and get control of that piece of life, right? I think we're doing the same thing. Myself.
Yeah, thanks very much for that challenge, Mike. I came across your Fifth Dimension project in schools in Mexico several decades ago. Do the same kind of thing with got an open school project at the moment, CamTree, which is teachers doing close to practice research and sharing it globally. So I'd love to connect with this school, University of the People. That's exactly the kind of project, a kind of deschooling, Ivan Illich type webs of networks. And I wonder what Roy thinks about that idea, because it wasn't too clear in your paper about a transformation in knowledge that might come about as the result of this new communications technology, i.e. not schooling for knowledge representations, but for precisely what Illich was talking about, schooling for convivial networks. Schooling is kind of connectionism, but with a bit more soul. I mean, because I know, Roy, you've talked about that sort of thing. I remember you waving Manuel Castell's book around about this transformation to a social network. I don't know if you know Pierre Levy's collective intelligence ideas. What do you think? Are we going that way? How can we help?
We certainly have more and more instances of distributed intelligence, collective intelligence. I guess I worry considerably about a small number of companies worth trillions of dollars that are economizing everyone's attention, and that's where the incentives are.
The control of attention, yeah.
And if you simply look at the patent streams coming out of companies, Facebook, for example, has a number of patents that relate to measuring arousal with a phase computer and pricing ads proportionately in relation to the arousal from watching how people's pupils expand.
Right.
This is where things are headed. It's very much of a Neil Stephenson kind of world.
Well,
it's written with my students a paper on 4 surveillance technologies.
Right.
They all relate to surveillance capitalism. And this is truly gloomy.
Roy, I'm not entirely up on it, but my view of what the Chinese are doing with AI in early classrooms seems to be exactly the same thing.
Yep.
That is, they're using the technology to micro identify kids' interests and abilities and start streaming them on the basis of that stream of the data that they've collected on the individual kids. That seems to me to be taking the science of education in Sumeria to a sort of one form of its logical conclusion. Just pick all the people who can do all this work for us, and we'll create a worker bee class of this at this level. I think the thing about networks is there's no hierarchy. And I just don't, large groups of things coordinated with each other in a system, there's usually some sort of hierarchy there. So that I think we're pushing toward openness and heterarchy, getting away from any, the sort of level playing field. Evolution doesn't work that way. We just can't stop evolution, I don't think we can.
Certainly regulatory bodies can break up monopolies.
They can. If the government in power wants them to do it and weren't put in power by the monopolies themselves.
Yes, well, we are in a new Gilded Age. There's no doubt.
I know. Yeah. And we do have the opposite. I introduced the use of the internet into the Russian Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Psychology. I thought I was doing a really good thing opening up the world. Yeah. Just if you didn't know where the road to hell was paved with, so I'm big into my own intervention world on people being self-critical. It's really easy to be critical of the system. Now start getting self-critical about your solutions.
Well, the catch with collective intelligence and all these socio-technical systems, generative as they are, is that there is no reason whatsoever that they steer towards the good. I mean, values and axiology have a very complicated relationships to technology innovation.
Mm-hmm. Right. And we're being really gloomy here. On the other hand, we're not being gloomy in the sense that obviously there are ways to solve things. Obviously, if you could give people an iPhone or a cell phone in rural Africa, and that allows them to get over hungry time and be able to feed their family, and fantastic. Of course you want to do that. Can't not do that. Yes. There's a question there. Help.
Was it me?
No. It's a young woman at Cambridge.
Oh.
You had your hand up. Somebody had her hand up.
Brad, maybe. I hope somebody could put a case for them. They're being very dystopian. And I tried to read that Neil Stevenson book about metaverse. I had to put it down. It was so American. Honestly, that kind of ridiculous individualism is not what you find in most of the world. I couldn't read it. I mean, what do you think, Brad? Don't you think there's potential here? This dystopian vision is really exaggerated?
It gives me a question. So again, moving forward, but with a question. So if COVID, you say, exposed the cracks in the system, what is the next milestone or an event or a signposting that we can heed before it gets here? I know that you couldn't say COVID was going to happen, but perhaps a pandemic was going to happen. Perhaps people are staying at home. Are there any other proactive ways or signs that we can look for so that we can maybe remedy some of these things as they're happening or even before?
I'm extremely inspired by the leadership coming from Greta and others around climate change. I mean, I think you could be an enormous turning point.
Right. And I would say I'm being dystopian pretty much because I also agree with Greta. I think there's a fire and I want people to start paying attention to it, but not to think that the answer is going to come within schooling itself. It can't come just within schooling itself. Schooling can produce alternatives. It can argue, and when it has an opportunity, like the rich people who are supporting really interesting things, right? That's great, but it's still working within a system that's going to, as people are pointing, it keeps increasing the inequalities. Every step in media has always had, as a result, a society that has large inequalities built into it. And if not, it doesn't last for very long. Again, to be anti-dystopian, read the book by David Graeber, and I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the second author's name, because they're making a very strong case that it doesn't have to be this way, that there have been places in the past with large aggregations of people that were very horizontal, where there seemed to be hardly any hierarchy, and it lasted for hundreds or thousands of years. So it can happen. Nobody's saying it can't happen, but don't kid yourself that you're working down in here when, as Roy says, you're inside a system which is undoing what you're doing faster than you can do it. So you have to organize locally to make visible alternatives that people can come to. And I think we see a number of people with that same kind of idea. Here's something you could really get behind. Let's see. And so our work, the work of people I talk to, blends into social movement theory, about which I hardly know anything. But there are people who really make the connections between sort of the level of intervention stuff that we do and people who are doing, they're taking big issues. And Annalisa Sannino is doing homelessness in Helsinki, and in a big way. And, getting behind people who are trying to get things done right, but the system isn't working right. Help them. And that's what you guys are doing at your university when you get involved with the theory and practice side of this, which is really essential, because otherwise you just make up the world in your laboratory or in your office or in your little play place, and that world isn't that way.
Here a case that maybe can give us a little bit of hope. So I'm right now in Chile. Chile had a huge student movement 10 to 15 years ago that came from the schools, came from the classrooms. Students were fed up with the low quality of education because that didn't give enough opportunities for social mobility. Then that was picked up at the university level by other student movements. Today, last month, we just elected one of the heads of that student movement from 2010 as our president. So I wouldn't say that the school, there's no hope for us working at schools. Of course, it's all interlinked with the political system and the social movements, as Michael Cole just referred and reminded us about. But, I think the school still is a good space for developing critical minds and, the people that will design the futures are there. And so, yeah, I mean, it is a difficult task, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. I will talk to you about this in 4 years' time, when the former president would, of course, be put away from other social movements. But, you know, at the moment, there is hope.
I've got a kind of quick follow-up question with, of course, a tiny bit of a comment at the beginning. So when I first decided to get into education, I was between education and law. I've been doing a little bit of living for myself and decided I wanted to do something where I could maybe have some sort of impact on how I would want the world to be. Okay, I'll talk into this one. And so I change from within. But so what kind of
Is it just me, or I just cannot hear what's going on in the room?
Yeah, I also have some audio problems.
Okay, Alison, would you mind turning on your microphone while Ryan speaks?
Won't be good, but I'll remember.
You have to repeat yourself, Ryan.
All right. Should I start at the beginning?
Yes, please.
I'll start with the brief comment. So when I was trying to decide what to do with myself after kind of living for myself for a while, I was deciding between being a lawyer or being a teacher and getting into education, because I did see some things that I thought could be different in the world. Did decide to go into education, was a teacher, a bit frustrated with policy, decided, to do a master's.
Awesome.
Again, we are losing audio. Alison, would you mind turning on your microphone?
I hope it doesn't echo everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, these big rooms are often a problem.
We're doing great. What happened?
Change. Do you want to try that?
Yeah. All right.
No,
We have an echo, unfortunately.
yeah, it's an issue. Okay, we'll have to just.
I hear Alison.
Yeah, we can hear Alison,
Okay.
but then
Now there might be less echo.
now the room is being muted, so
Okay.
I guess we are through Alison's computer now.
Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I'll try to make it even briefer this time. So I was trying to decide what to do with myself after kind of living for myself in my early 20s, and I was torn between law and education. I knew I wanted to do something that could maybe have an impact on society. I'd watched the Occupy things happen, and I just seen minor forms of protest. But so I did decide to go be a teacher. Decided to do a master's in educational leadership and technology. Kept just being frustrated with policy type decisions in a big district. Came here, did a master's, and now I'm doing a PhD, and I'd always heard, rage against the machine, but maybe for rage within it. So I thought I'll get in education. I'll try to make some change. I'm getting involved with groups such as DEFI, but I want to know how, as an early PhD student, just in my second year, how can I do these things and still have a career or still have a future? Because I do understand for established people, you're able to go more against the norms, but how would you advise myself and others who are early career or still PhD students? How can we do these things and still be employed? And it's a very earnest question, because I do want the answer.
Great question.
Well, I think what you do, I went through a similar experience in my life where I reached a point where I could either be a physiological psychologist of learning sticking needles in dogs' brains, or I could be starting to work with people in West Africa who had never seen any schooling, and working people of my own. So I'd be involved as a social player. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. What I think what you want to do now is to associate with yourself with some area of human practice that's everybody sees as a problem. Just what you're doing. And then if you're going through academia, try to find yourself a job which forces you, or at least allows you, to actually work in an actual community with actual people facing actual problems. And then you'll start to learn and try to make better practices there and try to make it spread. That's what we all do. And when I'm being dystopic, you can see I'm not dystopic at all. I'm going for it all the time. I'm currently doing other discussions like this because we're in an international crisis, right? And I have a history of interacting with Russians. I do not like seeing 60 years of my life devoted to international communication go back again to it's just like 1962 when I went there in the first place. It's rotten. It's just terrible to look at that long history. So there are ways, and where you have to start is start where you can do some good and where you're positioned to do good, and people will support you for doing it. And try to be able to work in more than one setting at a time, one of which at least supports you. So you're not an actor, washing dishes in order to be able to act, but you might be a college professor, an educator of some sort in one of these hybrid situations where you can, in fact, obviously make a difference. You're not saving the world, but you're making a difference.
Sounds like DEFI is exactly this kind of place from what I'm understanding about it.
Me too. That's why I say this is a great initiative at a great time. To me.
And get a lot of experience doing high quality ethnographic field work, publish your work. You will become an essential member of technology development teams because they need information on the ground. The worst thing in the world is having a bunch of engineers sitting around thinking about the functions that should be in an education technology. They know
or teachers sitting around saying how to build a computer.
There are a couple of questions in the chat which I think are related to this. In two quite different ways. One asking how the metaverse and 3D and immersive technologies and may accelerate some of the changes that we've seen, and a second one asking, which I think you've partially answered, are there ways, staying with Ili, are there ways of designing or using educational technology that give us hope of challenging radical monopoly?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know. I'm great. I think we've touched on those problems. I don't know what to add actually to what was said. Maybe Roy has something to add.
Well, I'll say something about augmented reality, virtual reality. I collaborate closely with a colleague here at Stanford, Jeremy Balanson. He has a book I highly recommend called Experience on Demand. He also runs the Virtual Human Interaction Laboratory. And he's a social psychologist, and he's done a lot of work on VR as an empathy machine. And that's uplifting and positively promising, yet at the same time, experiences of intersectional identities in online gaming worlds by Gabriella Richard and others indicate that there are intersectional oppressions that become opened up when you are in virtual realities and online gaming worlds. Sexism, racism, ableism, classism, anti-transgenderism. I mean, all of these things get very ugly in virtual worlds. So I'm personally not too enthused about collaborative virtual worlds where people do not have coping mechanisms for dealing with, if you think trolls are bad in Twitter or something, just imagine it when you're wearing a face computer and they're in your face all the time. I don't like this phrase, but it is coming. You will all be wearing face computers.
Face computers. So, Google glasses or something.
Right. Yep.
Facebook already has them.
Right.
Google will refine them. Apple will have its own version, and it will claim that it cares more about your privacy.
We need some positive, don't we?
The other thing to say about digital divide,
Thanks.
and I've been at this for like 40 years, and there's no question that the following statement is true. A digital divide is built into the economics of computing. The whole point, if you look at Intel and other microprocessor producers and look at where they spend their money, in addition to creating large fabricating plants, they spend huge amounts of money funding startups and companies that will create the next best wave that will use the more demanding processors that are going to be produced 4 to 5 years out. That is why we're so suddenly seeing everything about VR and AR, because those applications will require the computing capabilities that are only now emerging. You look at NVIDIA and other chip companies like that and how they're doing. But the point there is that as soon as those capabilities get wired into the emerging technologies, which are going to cost more, there will be hand-me-downs of the current advanced technology to those less economically well-abled. And there will always be that gap, and it'll often be 2 generations, right? So there are a lot of schools that are still using PCs from the 90s. But given that it's wired into the technology industry to create digital divides, those digital divides, at least I don't see how those will be overcome. It needs to be culture that finds a way to overcome the economics of the digital divide built into the computing industry.
Mm-hmm. At this point, I'm wondering, so do we need to master these new technologies in order to be part of the, you know, like working force that makes a change? Or can we, you know, just know how to use word processor and email, or Excel and email, in order to continue and, like, you know, make a difference?
No, I'm big on multimedia literacies, and people already can be creating virtual field trips with 360-degree video. There are a lot of empowering technologies, and if you're an author and you can develop an audience and you can develop community, you can develop modes of social action. I mean, look, if you just simply look at the size of the influencer economy, it's depressing, but all these kids in YouTube that are making, in some cases, millions of dollars creating makeup videos and things that are important to their peers. Those same powers could be let loose on more pro-social, positive change activities. The infrastructure is there.
Mm. So basically, if we want to continue being part of the machinery, then it's fine to be a basic user. But if we want to influence it, we need to be an advanced user. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Yes, you want to be able to make the technologies, contribute to making the technologies, or at least the artifacts that are created with the technologies.
Mm-hmm. Now, these problems were present. I mean, people mentioned 81, 82, and that was when I first got an Apple II, and that was what we started with, right? So it's been, the rate of change has just been, and Roy has this nice, that graph of Moore's law, you know, the computing power. But as I put in the chat, what part of what is going on here is the enormous amount of energy that these new emerging technologies require. So we figure we'll have part of the Philippines will be plastered over with solar, so that you can have servers using the energy. So it's so weirdly opposite from the way it was when you had a token and you exchange a token to incur an obligation and remember that somebody owed you something back. It was like a bundle of material stuff, and you could see it. Now, what is it that's moving around in the air and moving money? Where is it? It's like, so I think it's really a different life that this is all emerging as a part of, where technology has been there from the beginning. Technology is our human thing, right? That's in the way that we're taught. We're now technologia, right? And so, you know, I do think that going back and taking this broader view of how have people thought about technology as technologia, of theory and practice, because you hear that all the time. Usually it's, I'll have a theory and I'll go out and I'll change somebody else's practice to see if the theory is correct. Right. Now there are new ways of trying to do this, right? Roy is doing this and you're saying, well, yeah. On the other hand, you don't want somebody going like that. So keep the hands the other way. You all have been very patient here listening to
anyone got anything positive to say about the future of technology and about the possibilities? Do you have something to say?
It will be as wonderful as in the future as it has been in the past.
I would say so I was always thinking about I would just throw back to the equity thing is that what comes to technology is that so now we as educators, we have more of the ability to manipulate or create this world of future for our next generation. And also about affordances is that making equity, to me, it seems more like how we can make the affordances of technology available to, students from everywhere. And then maybe with those technology in hand, like the Roblox and also like the other games, and also with now the Open University and things, I would say, at least in this point, we are making affordances more available to students from everywhere, even in India. In everywhere. Yes.
Oh, thank you. That sounds a bit positive. I want to go back. Am I allowed to, Pablo? Just go back.
We have 2 minutes before 6:30 or 10:30 California time. So we're probably going to be starting to wrap up, but if you want to say a last words, Rupert, why not?
Oh, well, I was just going back to my original point, which referred to Habermas's reconstruction of historical materialism. Basically, what is the opposite of all this inequality? If you just focus on production, you end up with inequality, polarization, you need a revolution. He was saying that there's also a drive for communication. This is what has driven the internet. This is what drove the cities in Mesopotamia. People got together before they developed the productive capacity because they wanted to talk to each other, and in a way they wanted to love each other and create a larger community. And you can see this is what's driving all these initiatives here. So it's not all negative, because there's another drive, communication. The moment you enter into dialogue with somebody, you have axiology, you have a drive for justice and a drive for truth. And we can see this in this conversation as well. So if you just focus on, okay, so they might have different tools, but that's not education. That's not, that's just different tools. Anyway, so there's a positive element to all this, which I think you were missing a bit in your paper. You see my point? What do you think?
Has to go.
Roy, Michael, do you want to react?
Well, I've already answered that question in one way, Rupert. I thought it was absolutely wonderful when I could have a joint project with Russian colleagues who knew more about certain kinds of developmental organizations in education than I did. I really thought I wanted to communicate. They wanted to communicate. Okay, and so as I said, when you communicate with more people, you reorganize the social relationships between those people. Maybe it'll come out better. I love creating organizations where people interact just like we're interacting, right? The issue is how do you make those kinds of things spread in society? That's the issue. And so there's always hopefulness because there's always hopeful things going on.
And I think you've done a lot of good work in that direction. And
I do too, but but I'm not saving humanity with it.
Well, maybe it's a very long-term vision.
It is a long-term. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Only together we can save us.
Yes.
We do 7 billion people to work on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
We should crowdsource that problem.
Well,
thank you very much for the good advice for DEFI. We're going to go more transdisciplinary and bring in some big institutional visionary types. It's very useful.
It's clear, from this discussion, I think it's clear that it's a good thing to work both at the level of schools and at the level of social movements and society. So I think it's a good thing we can move forward and include more societal discussions in our readings. And with that in mind, I suppose I just will say thank you to Roy and thank you to Michael for joining us today, and invite you to engage with us in the next months and years. We'll continue our conversations about the topics we've been discussing here today with new readings, new materials, new research, and new activism. So thank you very much to everybody. And yeah, we'll, I suppose, stop the recording, whoever is recording.
And I want to thank Alison and Dina very much for their excellent comments. They were provocative and very apt. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Alison and Dina.
Thank you all together for the invitation. This has been a really nice experience. I wish you a lot of luck. And as you're starting off, as I say, it's a great time to start to do this kind of work. So go to it.
On DEFI developments.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Thank you very much, Roy. Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you for everybody joining us today. We just going to say for now, bye and see you later.
Okay.
Bye-bye.